All right, today we're going to just hit the highlights of Chapter 3, parts of Section 3 and Section 4. We're starting with passive transport. Passive transport, just like the name suggests, does not require the input of energy. It is passive. It happens on its own. And this happens quite a bit in cells, and normally it just looks like molecules moving directly across the cell membrane, like what we see in this picture here to the right. So if these molecules are able to pass through the membrane, maybe it's something like oxygen that can diffuse through membranes. If there's a lot of oxygen on one side of the membrane, it will passively, without the use of energy, diffuse right through that membrane to the inside where there's a lower concentration. So when we're talking about passive transport, there's two types. We have diffusion, which is what we just discussed over here, something diffusing directly through membrane. But then we also have this special instance of osmosis. Osmosis is still diffusion, but it is specifically the diffusion of water across a semi-permeable membrane. So what you see here, the blue dots are water, the green dots are some kind of solute like sugar that can't pass through a membrane. So the water moves from the left side to the right side, going from where there's initially more water to where there's less water, and that is osmosis. Remember that in passive transport, we always have molecules moving down their concentration gradient. Now, some molecules can only go through a special protein. They can't just go through the membrane on their own. That last slide, the molecule that we had talked about was oxygen. It's small enough to go through the membrane. It's nonpolar, so there's nothing to block it. But things like ions, which would be things like sodium, potassium, chloride, things like that. Polar molecules, or any kind of large molecule, a macromolecule like a starch or a protein or a sugar, those are too big to fit between the phospholipids, so they require some kind of protein like this blue protein in the membrane to allow them to diffuse through the cell membrane. It's still moving from high concentration to low concentration, so this is still diffusion, but it's diffusion that needs help from a protein. So we call it facilitated diffusion because if you facilitate something, you help it happen. A good example here would be water, which is polar. Water is pretty small, so sometimes it can sneak through the membrane, but most of the water that goes in and out of the cell goes through this special protein called an aquaporin. It allows water to go through and diffuse across the membrane, and that would be an example of facilitated diffusion, specifically of water diffusing, so that would be osmosis as well. And finally, we have active transport. In active transport, there is the requirement of energy. The cell has to use energy in the form of ATP. And because we're using energy, that means that this process is not going to happen on its own. It can only happen if the cell has enough ATP. And the reason why this requires energy is because active transport is pumping molecules against their concentration gradient. We have in this diagram here, outside the cell, there's a low concentration of this molecule. Well, maybe it's something that needs to be inside of the cell, and you see there's a higher concentration there. If we want to move it from the outside to the inside, we have the input of energy, and that would be active transport, like this sodium-potassium pump that we see at the bottom. This is an actual membrane protein that actively pumps sodium and potassium onto the correct side of the membrane, and that is what allows nerve impulses to function the way they do. So that's going to be it for this overview. Super short and sweet, and if you have any questions, please make sure you ask those in class.